With nearly 20,000 visually confirmed equipment losses, Russia's gains have often been built on a lot of broken metal. And yet, as losses have continuously been replaced by wave after wave of reactivated or modernised Soviet equipment, for the Ukrainian defenders and some international commentators, it might sometimes feel like Russia's Soviet inheritance of armour and artillery is just endless. The reality, however, is that this style and intensity of fighting just isn't sustainable for either side. And militaries with ready access to an infinite stock of armoured vehicles probably wouldn't occasionally devolve into using Ladas for frontline assault duties. From Ladas and golf carts to 1950s tanks and 1940s artillery, it's clear not all is well in the Russian army's equipment picture. But the question I want to unpack today, using some of the best open source data we have available, isn't if the Russian ground forces can sustain this kind of fight, but instead, for how long? Since this will be a very data-heavy episode, we'll start with some grounding factors and assumptions. Then we're going to look at two major equipment categories that present potential issues. Firstly, the armoured vehicles that enable the Russian infantry to manoeuvre and undertake assaults, things like IFVs and APCs, and then the ground-based fires that are essential to absolutely everything the Russian military does, things like towed and self-propelled guns and multiple rocket launchers. In each case, we'll look at things like burn rates, replacement rates, and storage levels, and take a shot at generating some rough estimates based on current trends as to when Russia might start experiencing ever more significant issues. After all, it's one thing to write to Berlin on the barrel of your artillery piece in 2024. It's another to start rolling out guns that might actually have fought there. Then in the future, there'll be a video like this one on the Ukrainian equipment picture to enable us to compare the position of the two forces. But now, before we get into it, I'm pleased to welcome back a returning sponsor. When you first see a news headline, it can be hard to know if you're seeing it from all the angles or if critical information and context is being left out. Look at some of the coverage around the recent visit of the Russian Defense Minister to North Korea, for example, and some will flag that the visit was unannounced or put it in the context of North Korean arms supplies to Russia to support the fighting in Ukraine, while Russian state media put their headline focus not on Ukraine, but preventing a new war in Northeast Asia. The tool being used to quickly flip between headlines here is called Ground News. It's a combination website and app that allows you to quickly see how stories are being reported by drawing on more than 50,000 sources around the world. Plus, they often provide extra potentially useful context on those doing the reporting. Things like ownership information and evaluations of political lean and factuality based on the work of 3 independent news rating organisations. And then on top of all that, there are some really nifty features like the blind spot feed. Essentially, what this attempts to do is surface stories that might be comparatively underreported in the kinds of sources that you would ordinarily consume, which might be particularly interesting if you want to see how narratives might be forming across different parts of the media. I think online echo chambers can be a serious issue, and it's part of the reason I've been happy to have Ground News as this channel's first and longest running sponsor. And if you have been considering trying out this tool for yourself, now might be the perfect time. Because if you click the link in the description, that'll temporarily give you access to a 50% discount on their unlimited access Vantage plan. So if you're interested, consider giving that link a click and checking it out. Okay, so let's get some big picture assumptions in place about the Russian equipment model and how sustainable it might be. The key here is that the Russian model of replacing equipment is very much a hybrid. There is a constant flow of newly built, often relatively modern equipment, and a much larger flow based on the repair, reactivation, and potential modernisation of much older stuff. Russia has a large network of armour and artillery storage bases, which, because this is 2024, are very closely watched by commercial satellites and YouTubers. Back in 2009, Russia's network of storage and repair facilities was actually even larger than it is now, until the defense minister at the time, Serdyukov, went about trying to privatise and consolidate a lot of the network and scrapping a lot of old vehicles. Serdyukov reportedly wanted to get rid of about 10,000 pieces of derelict and old equipment from the strategic reserve, but only about 4,000 were disposed of before he was chucked out, and Shoigu and Gerasimov were in. Since February 2022, we've seen that network start to re-expand. Repair work in the Russian army can now broadly be divided into 3 categories, with minor repairs being done in Ukraine itself, moderate repairs involving a vehicle often being sent to a wartime repair facility either in Ukraine or within Russia, and major repairs which involve vehicles being sent back to the factory or specialised facilities within Russia. Russian sources claim that if a vehicle is sent to one of those lower-level restoration points, it usually only takes about 2 or 3 days to get it fixed. And for our purposes, those vehicles wouldn't generally count either as visually confirmed losses or a successful repair and restoration. What that means is that when we get figures for Russian armoured vehicle output, often we're talking about vehicles coming from 3 distinct sources. Factory new builds, equipment damaged in Ukraine that's getting a second lease on life and potentially a modernisation if it's lucky, and thirdly, the most common source of raw material for the reactivation and modernisation process, which is old Soviet equipment from strategic storage. So if we're trying to assess the sustainability of Russian equipment levels, there's usually 3 factors we might want to look at. The burn rate, which is how quickly they're churning through the stuff, the build rate, which is how quickly the factories can turn out truly new material, and then whatever deficit is created between those 2 numbers needs to be covered by the stock level. Around those 3 estimates, there's a lot of other data items we might use to sense check our work. Here, the visually confirmed loss data is probably a big one. If we're estimating that Russian IFV output, for example, is 10% new factory production versus 90% reactivations, we probably wouldn't expect 70% of the visually confirmed losses to be factory-fresh BMP3s. The crux here is that even if our individual data estimates aren't perfect around things like production, storage, or loss rates, by bringing them all together, we still might be able to generate a reasonable picture. To do that, however, we still need to make some assumptions and adjustments. For better or worse, I don't have access to the combined resources of a national intelligence agency, so caveats and assumptions up front, including data imperfections. Information can be wrong or incomplete, and there's always a chance we get fooled. Like this bloke here, who claims to be posing in front of a captured Leopard 2A4, which, as you can see from this angle, turns out to very clearly just be a decoy. Unless, of course, Rheinmetall is now in the business of building 120mm guns out of basic piping. But to make this work possible, I'm going to make a couple of assumptions regardless. One, we're going to take the images and counts of Russian equipment in storage and their classifications as correct. These are almost entirely down to the impeccable work of the likes of Covert Cabal, HIMARS and Jompy, all of whom I'll link in the description along with some of their content. We'll also assume that even though loss rates and withdrawal rates vary over time, going forward they'll continue at the average rate of the war so far. Despite its flaws, I'll also be using visually confirmed loss data to provide a soft floor to the loss rates of frontline systems in Ukraine, while for things further away from the front like artillery, I'll place greater emphasis on withdrawal rate. I'll also assume that both Russia and Ukraine can use all of their equipment in Ukraine and don't have to send any overseas. That's perhaps not the safest assumption, given that in the last 2 weeks, Russian ally Syria has lost something like 180 tanks and 106 BMPs, but I'm going to assume that if Damascus does ask for additional equipment, Russia's response will be the diplomatic equivalent of new phone who dis. The final assumption/caveat has to do with the bane of many a model, the issue of feedback, aka your model may be linear, but reality isn't. We're going to assume straight-line system loss rates, even though you assume that if a system became rarer, loss rates would presumably go down, as there were simply fewer of them on the battlefield for the enemy to fire at. Realistically, we wouldn't actually expect Russia to ever fully run out of any particular system. We'd just expect them to become supply constrained the way they have with long-range missiles, with usage dropping to match availability. Basically, I'm trying to calculate where Russia will be based on the trends we've seen so far. But as we go through, make sure you remember that trends can change. So with all that said, let's get into the metal. And I wanted to start by looking at the infantry fighting vehicles, think BMPs and BMDs. While tanks are obviously a great nice to have, the IFVs and APCs have been filling a variety of almost essential roles. Carrying infantry across the grey zone, supporting them during assault actions, or repelling enemy attacks. We've seen how effectively the Ukrainians have often pushed the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle into service, for example, not just to carry infantry, but also to repel Russian armour. That's not to say it's impossible to launch offensive actions without these kind of vehicles in Ukraine, of course, but if we're talking about Russia's bread and butter mechanised assault tactics in Ukraine, you're going to need BMPs or some sort of substitute vehicle. For this section, I've split Russian IFV storage and loss figures into 4 main buckets: BMP3, BMP2, BMP1 and BMD. The BMDs are the airborne IFVs, smaller, lighter and much less heavily armoured, also you can push them out the back of an aircraft in a hopefully survivable fashion. Of the remaining 3, BMP3 is the most modern vehicle and the only one in active production, but made up a minority of the Russian army going into Ukraine. The BMP2 was the most common of the vehicles in service, but had also gone out of production. And the BMP1 was by far the oldest variant and had been almost completely withdrawn from frontline Russian service in February 2022. One of the really neat things about those BMP models from an open source intelligence perspective is that the only model still in active production, the BMP3, is also quite visually distinct. What that means is that when we see a BMP3, we can be fairly confident we're looking at a recent production or pre-invasion vehicle. At the other end of the spectrum, when you see a BMP1, you can be fairly confident you're looking at a reactivated storage piece. For a variety of reasons, there was some public talk of restarting BMP2 production back in 2022, but the firm that manufactures Russia's BMPs came out and said that restarting production would actually be more expensive per unit than just scaling up BMP3 production, while also producing a less modern vehicle. So for the purpose of this video, I'm going to be assuming that replacement BMP3s are new or overhauled vehicles, while replacement BMP1 and 2s are from repair and reactivation efforts. Those reactivations pull from what once might have seemed like an inexhaustible pool of replacement vehicles that's now looking strangely exhaustible. Starting with the airborne vehicles, based on the satellite imagery, Russia started the invasion with more than 660 BMDs in storage. But now more than 400 of those have been removed, and nothing that remains is visually assessed as being in decent condition. Add to that the fact that the vast majority of those vehicles are on bases where the imagery is about 6 months old, and I think it's fair to describe the BMD pile as pretty much tapped out. Then for BMPs, the pre-war storage inventory was north of 6,300, of which about 40%, around 2,600, have subsequently been removed, including pretty much all of the BMP2s and a lot of the BMP1s that were in better condition. Of that remaining 3,600 to 3,700 BMPs, about 1,900 are assessed as being in that worst category. That means vehicles that from space look pretty much like junk. They might be missing turrets, they might be missing engines, they might be rusted out hulks, so it's a question whether or not restoring them would actually be worth it. That leaves roughly 960 vehicles in poor condition and 890 assessed as decent. Adjust for the age of the images, some of which date back 6 months or more, and that 890 figure could now start with a 5. If you look at it in proportional terms, Russia has pulled out just about every BMD it can find in decent condition, and for BMPs, if we assume that good quality vehicles were pulled first, about 80% of their good stock. Noting, of course, that we are working with satellite images here, so it's entirely possible for a vehicle to be classified as decent and yet still have serious invisible internal issues. And for me, in the absence of some other piece of qualifying information, I don't think you can look at charts like this one and not conclude that over the medium term, the Russian BMP fleet might be under threat, while the BMD fleet is probably endangered. What might make that prognosis even more urgent is that while you might expect as storages begin to run down that the Russians might be more conservative with the equipment, or we might start to see losses fall, 2024 has actually been an abysmal year for the Russian IFV fleet. As you can see on screen there, Russian IFV losses were sky high through 2022, but then fell to around 100 per month for much of 2023. That's still about 4 times the estimated rate of BMP3 production that year, but it was a less significant bleed. Going into 2024 though, we saw those loss rates skyrocket. Russian visually confirmed IFV losses in Q1 2024 were higher than any other period of the war to date, pushing up to a point where Russia would be losing more vehicles in a month than it would be producing in a quarter. As a side note, the ratio between Russian and Ukrainian IFV losses also shifted significantly after Ukraine ceased to be on the offensive. A ratio of roughly 4-to-1 losses in 2022 dropped below 3-to-1 in 2023, but then spent the next 12 months of war around an astonishing 9-to-1. Put that all together, and for the Russian IFV fleet, you get a picture that is in some ways much more dire than we see in other equipment categories, including main battle tanks. Because even if you assume that every BMP removed from storage has been reactivated, and you take those relatively optimistic assumptions about Russian production levels, even if you make an adjustment for the age of the images, you still come up short. Just over 3,000 vehicles pulled from storage, a bit over 1,000 manufactured, against 5,000 visually confirmed losses. What makes this astonishing is that in most categories, we presume that Russia is mostly able to keep up with its losses, and the limiting factor is how many vehicles it has in storage, and how many of them are in good enough condition to enable relatively easy reactivation. Whereas with BMPs, at times just the ability to get them repaired and reactivated fast enough might have been a relevant challenge. Over time, you'd expect numbers like that to manifest a number of symptoms, some of which were arguably already seen. Greater polarisation in equipment quality, where you have a wider and wider gap between the newly built, relatively modern BMP3s, and on the other hand, the flow of increasingly less choice equipment that might be flowing out of storage. To an extent, this might be mitigated by doing things like cannibalising stored BMP1s to enable the restoration of damaged BMP2s, but the qualitative gap in the Russian IFV force is arguably far more severe now than it was in February 2022. The other thing we might see more of is outright substitution, where the Russians try and use vehicles that are not BMPs to do BMP things. There's a couple of ways this could work, and we have at least anecdotal evidence of all of them. You could substitute in a heavily armed wheeled vehicle like the BTR-82 to fill the BMP's role of infantry transportation and fire support, but without the mobility provided by the track. This might be something we're particularly seeing in Kursk, where the BTR-82 has become very common in the visually confirmed loss data. Another option would be to use less heavily armed track vehicles, so basically APCs, we'll get to that category in the moment, or in some cases we've seen the Russians give up on the armoured protection and armament entirely and go for straight speed. That's the domain of things like motorcycles and militarised golf carts. Suffice to say, none of those are going to be perfect substitutions, but if BMP supplies become increasingly tight, Russian forces may increasingly conclude that an imperfect vehicle is better than no vehicle. But before we get into potential substitute vehicles like MTLBs and BTRs, Let's talk projections. This is obviously always going to be a very rough exercise, but on average, between February 2022 and the end of November 2024, Russia has lost on average about 424 infantry fighting vehicles per quarter, more in 2022 and 2024, comparatively fewer in 2023. Alongside that going forward, I'm going to assume a new build rate of 135 BMP-3s per quarter. That's equivalent to the number of BMP-3s Russia is believed to have both new builds and substantially rebuilds in their best quarter of 2023. As an assumption, that probably errs on the more generous side, but at the same time, we're not including the much lower but still non-zero level of new production BMD-4s. So on balance, I'd suggest it's fair enough. That gives you a deficit that has to be covered by reactivated and repaired vehicles of about 290 per quarter if you take the visually confirmed losses as they are, or about 370 if you add an extra 20% premium for vehicles that wear out or become constructive losses. Both of those figures align fairly well with the rate we've seen Russia pull BMPs and BMDs out of storage to date, which has averaged out to about 345 per quarter. What we can do then is generate a range, using both the high and low estimates for the number of vehicles Russia needs to pull out every quarter, and the high and low estimates for the number of vehicles that they still have in decent condition. That would result in Russia running out of decent quality BMPs in storage anywhere between 1.5 and 3 quarters into 2025. If you then presume Russia might be able to cannibalise those poor quality vehicles into functional vehicles at a 2-to-1 exchange rate, that buys you roughly another 2 quarters. 1,160 poor quality vehicles becoming 530 mostly functional replacements, good to either limp the Russians almost to the end of 2025 or through the first quarter of 2026, depending on the estimate you're going with. All else being equal, once the Russians hit that point and any vehicles held in, for example, repair yards were also exhausted, the question of what was sustainable going forward would drop down to the rate of Russian production, plus what they're able to significantly repair just using vehicles damaged in Ukraine. Based on what we've discussed so far, I'd very roughly suggest that would mean the Russians having to reduce the rate of BMP losses by about 2/3. Anything short of that, and you'd expect the fleet to start dwindling away over time. Turns out that given enough time and FPV drones, apparently you can burn through just about everything, including the Soviet BMP stockpile. Okay, so if stored Soviet BMPs in decent condition are becoming increasingly rare as a species, what about some of the other vehicles like armoured personnel carriers that Russia might lean on to transport and support its infantry instead? Here there are a couple of vehicle families we could talk about, but I'm going to discuss 2 of the numerically most significant, as in stuff that is so common that it might feel like the Soviet Union right-clicked them both onto auto builds and then forgot about them. Firstly, the MTLB, which has the tracks of a BMP but lacks the armament. And secondly, the BTRs, which in some cases, like the upgraded BTR-82s, might have a significant armament, in that case a 30mm cannon, but have to rely on wheels for mobility rather than tracks. None are going to be perfect substitutes for each other in all cases, just as M113 Bradley and Stryker aren't perfect substitutes under all circumstances. But they all meet the basic requirement of being a metal box, capable of carrying infantry. The MTLB is actually more of a multi-purpose vehicle than a dedicated APC. It almost has a bit of a Bren gun carrier feel about it, and the Russian name roughly translates into lightly armoured multi-purpose towing vehicle. As an APC, it's broadly functional and does have a troop compartment, although from experience I've encountered bloody shopping trolleys that feel less cramped and give a more pleasant ride. What it is, however, is very simple, very cheap, and very versatile. In Ukraine, we've seen the Russians roll this thing out for just about everything, from carrying troops to towing artillery to command functions to medical evacuation, to serving as the base chassis for just about every Garry's Mod style project that Russian field workshops can come up with. The one on the right there, for example, appears to have been equipped with a very regulation set of 2 automatic 82mm mortars. We've even seen MTLBs converted into vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, with some Russian units filling the vehicles with explosives and then sending what we're pretty confident were unmanned versions towards Ukrainian positions. If you had an infinite supply of armoured vehicles and explosives, that kind of approach might make sense. But, as it turns out, Russia doesn't. As you can see on screen here, the stocks, as far as we can assess them, are looking more than a little strained, especially when you're talking about regular MTLBs, as opposed to the larger but generally unarmed MTLBUs. Most LBUs were generally intended for rear area and support roles, and so probably wouldn't be most military's first choice for taking on demanding frontline duties. Pre-invasion, about 3,200 MTLBs were visible in Russian storage, along with roughly 1,500 LBUs. Since then, around 2,800 MTLBs and 600 LBUs have been removed, and if you adjust for the age of the imagers, you can add another 340. Without a time adjustment, that would give about 130 MTLBs and 490 LBUs remaining in decent condition, While if you adjust for image age, the Russians would be out of decent quality MTLBs entirely. If you combine the two types together, as they can fill most of the same functions, you get this. Between about 70 and 80% of the overall stockpile removed, and maybe between 300 and 700 vehicles left in decent condition across both types. For a lot of militaries, that would be a very decent equipment buffer. But for the Russian army fighting in Ukraine, you'd probably argue that's cutting it dangerously close to exhaustion. If we treat the MTLB and MTLBU inventories as combined, then at the average withdrawal rate, you'd expect all of the decent quality vehicles to disappear sometime around Q2 2025, with the poor quality vehicles, again assuming a 2-to-1 cannibalisation rate, being enough to buy you perhaps an additional month and a half. In reality though, I expect there's a reason the MTLBs have so far been reactivated more quickly than the LBUs. And now that it's mostly LBUs left, we may see a significant fall in withdrawal rates. That would slow the rate of depletion, but also slow the flow of vehicles to the Russian army. Statistically speaking though, there is at least one thing that makes the MTLB figures stand out. If you're talking about systems like tanks or infantry fighting vehicles, there tends to be relatively close alignment between what we believe Russia is losing on the front line and what they're pulling out of storage. But with MTLBs and LBUs, there's a significant mismatch, with visually confirmed losses only equaling about 40% of what's been pulled out of Russian storage yards. There are a number of factors that could go into that, including Russia just building up the number of MTLBs in the force rather than just replacing losses, and 2024 has been the busiest year for MTLB losses so far, with 562 being lost compared to 532 in 2022. But I think it also suggests that MTLBs might be seeing significant use not just at that forward edge of the battle area where they're likely to be destroyed and photographed, but also a little bit further back. For example, one of the core original roles of the MTLB was to tow artillery pieces. But in February 2022, for the most part, the Russian army wasn't a towed artillery force. Most of its pieces were self-propelled, and so the need for MTLBs would have been somewhat moderated. But now that Russia has pulled thousands and thousands and thousands of towed artillery pieces out of reserve, well, you can't just have Private Conscriptovich and his mates push the things, and there's going to be plenty of terrain out there where you'd probably prefer tracks to a truck. So my point here would be, realistically, Russia doesn't just need enough MTLBs to replace MTLB losses. It presumably needs huge numbers of additional units to support all the towed artillery it's now using. Another main family of Russian vehicles in the capable of moving infantry column are the BTRs. For the most part, these are wheeled, very lightly armoured systems, but some of them can pack significant firepower. That's certainly the case for the BTR-82s, which have so far dominated Russian visually confirmed BTR losses in Ukraine. These are wheeled vehicles capable of carrying infantry that are either manufactured from scratch or upgraded from old BTR-80s and pack a 30mm cannon. That combination yields a lot of firepower, a lot of mobility, a lot of versatility, but the jury can sometimes be out a bit on survivability. In 2022, BTR-82s made up more than half of Russian BTR losses in the categories we're concerned with, while in 2023 and 2024, it was closer to 70%. In total, the visually confirmed losses of various versions of the BTR-82 total up to north of 1,000, meaning the system is likely very heavily used and has suffered greater losses than, for example, the BMP-3. But whether Russia can sustainably keep up with those kind of losses really comes down to how many of these vehicles are being produced. One estimate published by the Carnegie Endowment holds that Russian factories might be able to produce an estimated 300 to 400 new or modernised BTR-82s per annum. That distinction matters because there's at least two different ways to make a BTR-82. You can build it from scratch as a BTR-82A, or you can upgrade it from an old BTR-80 into a BTR-82AM. And once that process is done, good luck telling the difference externally in a bunch of grainy drone footage. Pre-invasion, back in 2020, when the Russian MOD ordered 460 BTR-82s, that was split between 130 new builds and 330 upgrades. How much of a difference to production rate it would make if they had to switch from upgrading old vehicles to building entirely new ones isn't entirely certain. But it absolutely matters because as far as BTR-80s visible in storage go, there aren't that many left. Pre-invasion, a majority of the identified BTR-80s in storage were held at a single storage base, with about 430 vehicles present. By September this year, that number was down to 73, with none of what was left assessed as being in decent condition. Functionally speaking, that means that while there might still be a lot of BTR-80s out there, spread amongst various units, concealed under cover, or at repair bases, for example, in the main storage yards, they're towing the line between endangered and extinct. Going forward, that presumably means more focus having to be placed on entirely new build units. And we've also seen signs of Russia trying to make up the numbers by pulling much older BTRs out of storage as well. And they don't always appear to have been particularly picky about it. If you want a sense right out the gate of where we are at this point, as far as we can tell, Russia has now largely depleted its reserves of BTR-50s. That's the vehicle you can see in the black and white photo in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, which entered service in 1952, and also the vehicle you can see in the top right-hand corner in 2024, a few seconds before it encounters a Ukrainian FPV drone. Pre-invasion, there were about 120 BTR-50s identified in Russian storage, whereas in the latest imagery, that's down to 41, none of which are in decent condition. Instead, most of what appears to be left in decent condition is made up primarily of BTR-60s, 70s, and various derivatives. That includes things like the 1V18 artillery battery command vehicles derived from the BTR-60, and you can see an example of that on the top right there with some interesting applique features. These kinds of vehicles might make up as much as 45% of the 580 identified BTRs still in decent condition in Russian storage, quite possibly because all of the modifications to the vehicles made to enable them to fill command duties made them less useful as APCs. Even the regular BTR-60s and 70s that are potentially suitable for battle taxi duty are obviously not as ideal as more modern equivalents. Compared to the BTR-82, the firepower of these vehicles is much reduced, and suffice to say, the standard infantry dismount method from some of these older vehicles makes for some fairly dramatic action shots, but probably isn't considered ideal by modern battlefield standards. With part of the problem being that in a lot of BTR models, the engine is located in the back of the vehicle, meaning there are no doors there. Questions of modernity and battlefield value aside, however, a mobile metal box is still a mobile metal box. And so for the purposes of calculating how long it might take until Russia burns through its BTR storages, I am going to include all of the BTR-60s, 70s, and relevant derivatives. And here there are two calculations I want to make. Firstly, how long it might take until Russia runs out of BTR-60s, 70s, and 80s in storage if it keeps withdrawing them at the same rate it has, on average, over the course of the war to date. By that measure, 37 BTRs in your average month against a remaining storage of decent quality vehicles of somewhere between 578, just based on the images, or 447 if you adjust for the age of those images, gives you a rough time to depletion of 12 to 16 months. Noting that about halfway through that process, out of necessity, you're going to be pulling things like command vehicles rather than dedicated APCs. Another calculation would be not to look at withdrawal rate so far, but instead burn rate. If we use an estimated loss rate of between 45 and 54 BTRs of relevant models per month, which is the visually confirmed losses on the low end and that with a 20% loading on the high end, then the math tells you Russia is going to continue having to pull vehicles out of storage, even if it is manufacturing 300 to 400 new BTR-82s per year, even if it runs out of BTR-80s to use as part of that production process. And if then Russia is pulling 16 to 25 BTRs per month to fill that gap between the production rate and the burn rate, your range of time to zero estimates runs from about 18 months out to 37. The conclusion here is probably A, that a lot hinges on how many genuinely new BTR-82s Russia is currently able to produce, and B, that if these assumptions hold roughly true, that while the newer stuff is pretty much completely gone at this point, Russia probably has enough older stuff to maintain withdrawal rates at least through the majority of 2025, but with an understanding that increasingly something's going to have to give when it comes to either quality or quantity if the war goes much longer than that. And the sustainability challenges may be applicable not just to the vehicles that transport the Russian infantry, but also the artillery systems that support them. Okay, so let's talk self-propelled artillery. If you've watched the channel for a while, you probably understand the Russian army is a very artillery-centric force. In 2021, Military Balance estimated the Russian ground forces, so we're leaving out VDV and naval infantry for a moment, had about 2,300 gun artillery systems in active service, which only about 150 were towed. Now that figure didn't include roughly 500 100mm towed anti-tank guns, but that still only gets you to a force of around 2,800 guns, of which more than two-thirds were self-propelled. Clearly, however, even that number of guns wasn't sufficient for the challenges the Russian army encountered in Ukraine. And so almost immediately in 2022, we started to see the Russians pulling self-propelled and towed artillery systems out of storage in order to upgun the force. By early 2024, RUSI estimated that just the Russian forces in Ukraine itself had nearly 4,800 barrel artillery pieces in service. And it seems the means to make up those numbers was to go storage shopping. As you can see on screen here, even if you don't apply a date adjustment and only work with the images we have, it looks like Russia has removed about 40% of its self-propelled guns from storage. If you do apply that linear adjustment to account for the date of the images, you get a number closer to 46%. And just as with basically every other systems category in this episode, the draw is not uniform between types. As you can see at this point, by far the most common self-propelled gun left in Russian storages is the 2S1. And as this chart shows, the proportion of those guns that have been pulled out of storage to date is also the lowest of all the types we're looking at. The kicker here, of course, is that the 2S1 is the oldest and arguably least useful of all of these types. It's a 122mm design that first went into production in 1971. If you consolidate the gun types by calibre, you also see that's a reasonably good predictor of what percentage of the inventory the Russians have pulled out. In this data set, there are fewer than 70 of the really big guns, the 203mm pieces, still in Russian storage, and the image we're relying on for that figure dates back to early May. If you made a linear time adjustment, which may not be the safest move with that particular piece, you'd only be looking at about 37 units left. As you can see here in proportional terms, the percentage of their inventory the Russians have chosen to pull out of storage is vastly different based on calibre. Depending on whether you want to include a time adjustment, it's very roughly 70 to 80% of the 203mm guns, 50 to 60% of the 240s, 40 to 50% of the 152mm pieces, and between a quarter and a third of the 122. And here I think it might be worth digging a bit deeper into both extreme ends of that spectrum. Why have the Russians been so keen to almost empty out their storages of some of those heavier systems, while the 2S1s are treated with about as much enthusiasm as the green salad at an all-you-can-eat buffet? With the 2S1, we're pretty much just guessing, but there's a couple of factors that might be coming into play. The ammunition itself might be part of the story. 152mm just generally has longer range and more hitting power than 122. And so all else being equal, if you have so many artillery crews and you need to equip them with pieces, you're probably better off giving them a 2S3 than a 2S1. Plus, by just about every estimate we have, Russian production of 152mm shells is considerably higher than that for 122. And we saw some complaints by Russian sources about localised shortages of 122mm shells as far back as 2022. So even if you did have a massive supply of stored modern 122mm self-propelled guns, the ammunition might not be there to justify the effort of reactivating them. And of course, 2S1 is not a modern, cutting-edge 122mm system. It's the oldest vehicle on this list. That has implications both for the quality and performance of the vehicle, but also the mechanical condition they might be in. And so, presumably for a range of reasons, Russia appears to have focused a lot of its reactivation effort elsewhere. For example, as I said, we have fairly strong evidence of them being very aggressive in reactivating 2S7 peons, the 203mm guns. The 2S7 certainly isn't the most modern vehicle. It went into production in 1975, and Australia actually has one in a museum. But it and the modernised version, the 2S7M, have two fundamental characteristics that have made them very useful and sought after in Ukraine. One is that they can huck a very large 100+ kilogram shell, and two, they can do it a fair long way. About 37 kilometres or 23 freedom units using standard ammunition, and closer to 47, so nearly 30 miles using rocket-assisted rounds. This piece of equipment probably wasn't optimised for the initial rush to Kyiv, but once the war started to bog down, that combination of range and hitting power appears to have been in high regard. Of a pre-war stock of about 218 in storage, we've seen roughly 150 2S7s removed, about 70%. And the change in loss rate over time certainly does point towards the Russians potentially reactivating more than a few of these systems. In 2022, they lost 6, in 2023, 15, and in 2024 to date, 10. Given the rate of visual confirmation on artillery losses tends to be very low, 31 losses against 150 reactivations and a pre-war active inventory of about 60 is quite heavy. And I think it might point to both A, these guns being used relatively extensively by the Russians, and 2, the Ukrainians not being massive fans of incoming 100+ kilogram shells, and so decided to do just about anything they can to knock the 2S7s out. The other system which has seen a disproportionate number of reactivations has been the 2S4 Tulpan. And if we're trying to be precise about it, this is probably better described as a self-propelled mortar, a very heavy self-propelled mortar. To an even greater extent than the 2S7, Tulpan arguably represents a concept that the Russian army was kind of moving away from before the invasion of Ukraine. And perhaps that makes sense, given there aren't many other armies out there operating relatively short-range, nuclear-capable mortars. But what 2S4 can do, kind of like 2S7, is deliver very heavy shells that can potentially be used to demolish, for example, defensive positions or buildings. Prior to the invasion, the team identified about 400 2S4s in storage, and as of the latest images, that number's reduced by roughly half. Of those roughly 200 pieces that are estimated to have been pulled out of storage, 55 have become visually confirmed losses. For a Russian artillery piece in this war, a visually confirmed loss rate above 25% is very high. 3 2S4s were visually confirmed lost in 2022, 30 in 2023, and 22 in 2024 to date. One factor potentially driving those 2S4 loss rates is something you could potentially call TOS syndrome after those short-range Russian thermobaric rocket launchers. It might be able to fling standard rounds 10 kilometres and maybe double that with rocket-assisted projectiles, which is not going to be every round available. In Ukraine, that almost certainly means getting in the range of opposing artillery in order to do your job, and potentially now, in 2024, getting into FPV and loitering munition range as well. On a couple of occasions, we've seen 2S4s start to appear in large numbers when there is a major fight going on over an urban agglomeration, but we've also often seen that correlate with a spike in 2S4 losses. Interestingly, one thing we haven't seen a lot of is Russia's most modern artillery systems. There was significant hype back in 2023 when some Russian sources indicated the country would be deploying some of its newest Koalitsiya 152mm self-propelled guns to Ukraine. These were reportedly going to make a lot of difference in the counter-battery fight and were now in serial production. But nearly a year later, we've seen very little of the system or others like it. No visually confirmed losses, no drone footage, not even much in the way of propaganda film, which is probably something you'd expect to see. We've seen some for the BMPT and Sukhoi 57, for example, even if the reason these new guns weren't appearing in the visually confirmed loss data was because they were really awesome, long-ranged and survivable. In fact, if you look at the Russian visually confirmed loss profile for self-propelled guns in January 2023 to now, there hasn't really been any change in the proportion of modern Russian guns that we're seeing. Think things like the M1 and M2 versions of the 2S19. That class made up about 10% of Russian SPG losses in January 2023 and still makes up about 10% going into January 2025. And what that suggests to me is that while we have continued to see some Russian production of new build modern artillery vehicles and deep modernizations, for the overwhelming part this is still a force dependent on legacy equipment. And in terms of trying to determine when Russia might run out of SPGs in storage, there are two main complicating factors. One is that unlike with the infantry fighting vehicles, tanks and APCs, the data we're using here doesn't include a quality assessment. That means the systems we're counting as in storage can range from in perfect working order and capable of going to the front and firing tomorrow, to self-propelled guns that are literally missing the gun part. The other complication is that SPGs aren't the main type of artillery system being reactivated, but we'll come back to that in just a moment. But with those caveats in place, if we assume that Russia continues to withdraw artillery from storage at the same rate as it has over the war so far, there's only one type of self-propelled gun you'd expect to run all the way to zero in 2025, and that's the 2S7 Pion, the long-range 203mm. The 2S4s, the heavy self-propelled mortars, would probably be in the extinction zone in the latter part of 2026, while the other gun stocks wouldn't run dry until 2027, or in the case of the ancient 2S1s, somewhere between 2028 and 2030. In short, while Russia has severely drawn down its storages of some of its most specialised self-propelled guns, on paper, the withdrawal rate for a lot of the inventory seems almost sustainable. But like I said, when it comes to Russian artillery and storages, there is a twist. And that's what we've seen happen with Russia's reserves of towed artillery. Remember, that RUSI report indicated that the number of gun artillery systems in the Russian military had increased, and most of them were now towed. In order for that estimate to make sense, you'd either need Russia to be dragging a lot more towed artillery out of storage than self-propelled guns, or taking massive disproportionately high losses in the self-propelled cohort. And if we look at the data, only one of those two things really holds true so far. Even if you don't make any adjustments for the age of the images, the latest satellite images we have suggest that Russia has pulled something like 6,700 howitzers out of storage, to say nothing of mortars. That's enough to outnumber the SPGs being pulled out at a rate of roughly 4-1. Enough to explain a major shift in the force towards towed guns, although not enough by itself to get us to that 80-20 ratio. For that, we'd need the Russian SPGs, including the many they started with, to be suffering disproportionately high losses compared to what should be the less survivable towed guns. To an extent that's happened. Visually confirmed self-propelled gun losses are about twice what they are for the towed guns, but from a statistical viewpoint in its own way, that number is also very strange. The Ukrainian experience has been that towed guns like the M777 are considerably more vulnerable than long-range mobile pieces like the PZH-2000, the French Caesar, or the Ukrainian Bodana. And indeed, a lot of military figures in forces around the world have been openly questioning the role of towed guns in future force structures, in part because of concerns over their survivability. But if that difference in survivability also held true for the Russian forces, and you take those storage removal figures as a given, you might expect to see two things in the data that, frankly, we just don't see. As you can see on the chart there, the ratio between Russian towed and self-propelled artillery losses has been a bit bouncy over time, but the share of SPGs in the losses actually peaked in Q4 2023 at nearly 80%, and towed guns have been comparatively rarer in the loss data through all of 2024 than they were at the end of 2022. And so you have one of the great statistical quirks or mysteries of the war in Ukraine so far. We see the better part of 10,000 Russian towed howitzers and mortars disappearing from storage, And we see a lot of evidence of at least some of them on the front line, including some really old designs. But the loss data never really seems to reflect all those guns arriving the same way it does for the Ukrainians. And thousands of guns, statistically at least, appear to just kind of be disappearing into the ether. Under the hood, there's a couple of things that could potentially be going on here. RUSI could, for example, be wrong about the 80-24 split, which might explain the loss data we're seeing, but not so much what's happening to all those Russian towed guns being pulled out of storage. It could also be that the visual evidence for Russian artillery losses is very heavily skewed in favour of the SPGs. Maybe towed artillery is disproportionately being lost to the kinds of threats that don't tend to capture visual evidence. Think things like radar-directed counter-battery fire, while SPGs that are more mobile can potentially displace and evade it. That could then leave the SPGs to be destroyed by things like drone-directed HIMARS strikes or long-range FPVs and loitering munitions. For that to be the only explanation, though, the skew would have to be major and look very different than it does for the Ukrainian forces. Another compelling explanation, then, might be that a lot of the guns that are being pulled out aren't actually being used for frontline combat duty. They might be going to training areas or second-line units where tungsten fragments are a less common feature of the local weather report, or a lot of them might so much be being destroyed as consumed, because all artillery barrels have a lifespan, and the further you push beyond that lifespan, the more dire the potential consequences become. Starting with relatively simple effects, like the development of Stormtrooper aim syndrome, all the way up to cases like the one you see on the right there, where the barrel communicates to the gun crew that it ain't going to shoot no more, and announces its resignation with a celebratory explosion and fragmentation. To illustrate the concept, if you assume the Russians had been firing about 10,000 artillery rounds a day on average over the course of the war, and you assume the average barrel life of Russian howitzers from the newly manufactured all the way to the 1950s relics was about 2,000 rounds per barrel, then the Russian artillery would have burned through about 5,000 guns over the course of 1,000 days of fighting. In a recent piece called Ore to Ordnance, RUSI examined the potential of artillery barrels as a potential bottleneck in Russia's military efforts in Ukraine, with one of the implications being that even without major sanctions deliberately targeting this part of the Russian war economy, Russia's ability to produce new barrels just couldn't keep up with demand. And so to an extent, I'd argue the data suggests that Russia might be pulling thousands of towed guns out of storage, not just to upgun frontline units or replace systems destroyed by the Ukrainians, but so the guns, or more specifically, the barrels of those guns, can be used as replacements. And that would be especially significant because it suggests that the more force that Russia is able to apply, the more ammunition it's able to source, the more rounds it puts down range, the faster it's burning through those barrels, and the more systems it needs to pull from storage. So with that little statistical mystery explored, let's start getting into some of the numbers by systems category. What did Russia have, what's it pulled, and what's left? And here I want to start with heavy towed mortar systems, noting that we're not counting things like regular 81mm infantry mortars, for example, but instead slightly chunkier systems like the semi-automatic 2B9 gun mortar system you see on the right there. For comparison, a British L16 81mm mortar weighs about 35 kilos. The Soviet 2B9, more than 630. Pre-invasion, these kind of towed mortar systems made up about 20% of all towed artillery pieces identified in Russian storages, about 3,000 pieces in total. They were presumably also seen as relatively good candidates for rapid reactivation and deployment to Ukraine. There were a lot of them, Russia presumably had a lot of ammunition for them, and they offered a relatively practical way to quickly add a lot of additional firepower to existing or newly formed units. And so, relatively soon into the invasion, these things started to appear just about everywhere, including on top of just about every vehicle with a horizontal surface that they could be welded to. We even saw some vehicle conversion concepts that could have come straight out of the pages of a World War II history book, like the one you see on the right there from 2023. But a side effect of deploying these things so widely is that the storages also ran down quickly. And so if you're wondering when Russia will run out of these systems in storage, the math is probably easier than for any other system we cover this episode. They already have. Pre-invasion, there were more than 2,900 systems classified as towed mortars visible in the satellite imagery. In 2024, there are 0. There may still be some concealed in buildings or at various repair facilities, but for the purposes of this exercise, these systems have graduated from vulnerable to extinct, which probably doesn't bode well for any new units Russia decides to form in the future that might have appreciated a couple of things like this. As you can see on screen here, the mortars are the only towed artillery category I looked at that's actually hit 0, but some of the other gun types aren't looking particularly healthy either. And it's clear both that the vast majority of the stockpile as a whole is gone, and that in most cases, quite understandably, the withdrawals appear to have focused on the most modern, capable and useful pieces. 2A36, for example, is a 1970s era piece, distinguished by having a relatively long range for a 152mm gun. So they've been heavily withdrawn. And the 2A65 on the far left there is an even more modern 152mm gun, this time dating from the late 1980s, and is very closely related to and fires the same ammunition as Russia's mainline SPG, the Master S. The older but still useful D20 and D30, 152 and 122mm guns have also been quite heavily withdrawn, and the only system where the number of guns identified in storage has gone up over time is the World War II era D1, which is often the result of previously unknown guns being reclassified, sometimes the result of better imagery becoming available, and that occurring faster than the Russians are drawing the numbers down. And indeed, if you roughly split the guns we can identify up by their relevant era, it becomes clear that the older a gun design is, the less likely it is to have been pulled out of storage. Leaving aside the mortars, which have been 100% withdrawn, the Russians appear to have pulled very roughly 70 to 80% of their Soviet-era guns out of storage, depending on whether or not you adjust for the age of the images. For unknown guns, however, that figure's somewhere between 40 and 44, and for World War II-era pieces, between 13 and 17%. And the side effect of that is that when you look at what Russia has left in storage, the situation's arguably far worse than the raw numbers might suggest, because a lot of the 5,000 to 6,000 guns that are likely to still be there are going to be designs that may literally be older than Vladimir Putin. Of the guns that have been identified, the World War II category is now the largest, although the task is complicated by more than half of what's left falling into the unknown category. This is because unless you get very high quality imagery of the base you want at the time you want, it can sometimes be very difficult to tell artillery pieces apart. That said, ahead of this episode, I did speak to Heimast, who's been very active in a lot of this work and reporting, and his sense was that of all the guns that Russia still has in storage, about half is now probably made up of World War II-era systems like M30 and D1, and a grab bag of other ancient out-of-service systems like D44. And one imagines the Russians would probably want to avoid deploying more field artillery with less range than some Ukrainian FPVs. In short, Russia still has a lot of towed guns in storage and isn't about to run out tomorrow. But if you're interested in stuff that fires modern, widely available ammunition and comes from roughly the right point on the tech tree, then the supply situation is probably much more constrained than that headline 5,000 to 6,000 figure. Saying there might be 3,000 Soviet-era systems left certainly hits a bit different when you realise they may already have pulled around 10,000. And for some of the best and most modern guns, 2A65 and 2A36, the total visibly remaining is closer to 440, or around 300 if you try to adjust for the age of the images used. Putting time estimates around this is going to be particularly dangerous for artillery because withdrawal rates have changed so much over time, but if we assume guns continue to be pulled at the same rate they have over the course of the entire war to date, we can come up with some illustrative estimates. For the positively identified Soviet-era guns, assuming all of them are functional enough to be worth withdrawing, depending on whether or not you use a time adjustment for what you estimate is currently remaining in storage, you'd expect the early Soviet guns to hit zero in 9 to 10 months, and the later Soviet pieces to last for 10 to 13. Both those figures are probably going to be stretched by some of the unknown guns actually being Soviet-era pieces, and at current rates, that unknown stock will take something like 4 years to fully deplete, while the World War II guns will eventually run out in the 2040s. In general, I do want to sound a bit of a note of caution about reading too much into these figures. Yes, the rate of withdrawal has been massive, in part because you imagine it's probably mechanically pretty simple to reactivate a towed gun compared to a self-propelled one, but as that RUSI report suggests, a lot of what's been withdrawn from storage probably has been used to upgun Russian forces rather than just replace losses. Assuming Russia is willing to be a bit stingier when it comes to equipping new units or upgunning old ones, it stands to reason they could probably slow down withdrawals for that purpose if they really needed to stretch their supplies. It also suggests that Russia probably has enough artillery left to feed the system through 2025. Where things get a bit murkier is when you start to look beyond 2025 or predict how the effectiveness of the Russian artillery might change over time. On one hand, there are probably factors that have increased the average effectiveness of Russian artillery units since February 2022. We've seen improvements in the reconnaissance fire complex, changes to artillery tactics, better integration of drones, and reportedly the wider scale use of laser-guided precision shells like Krasnopol. On the other hand, there are also some brakes pulling in the other direction. Over time, we've seen more older guns in the mix, anecdotally more complaints around things like barrel wear, and a much greater prevalence of North Korean ammunition in the Russian mix. Anecdotally, according to both Russian and Ukrainian sources, a majority of the North Korean ammunition does work, especially if it goes through a Russian facility first. But for the moment, the stuff does have a reputation for, shall we say, inconsistent performance and thoroughly dismal and inconsistent accuracy. If German Assegai 155mm rounds are match-grade ammunition, North Korean 152 is the Cold War-era surplus stuff that you buy by the pallet. And when you cheap out like that, there can be a price to be paid in precision. That kind of inaccuracy can be compensated for by simply firing more rounds, but that also means more barrel wear, which ultimately, if you're not making enough of them, means more guns have to be pulled from storage. A forward assessment of the Russian artillery force in Ukraine then probably distills down to it's complicated. There are almost certainly going to be enough Russian guns to fire the ammunition available through 2025 and into 2026, and there are various ways Russia could try to adapt as the supply situation degrades. But at the same time, most of the benefit that Russia is likely to be able to take out of that massive supply of towed guns has already been taken. If nothing else changes, over time we should expect the mix of guns in Russian service to get older, things like barrel replacements to come rarer, and new or regenerated Russian units to be less lavishly supplied with artillery than those that came before them. The Russian army, like the Soviet one before it, is an artillery army. It had an enormous number of guns, and it still has an enormous number of guns. But a side effect of constantly trying to outshoot the Ukrainians 2, 5, 10 or more to 1 is that they've also been burning through their resources at a much greater rate. And if the trends hold, we should expect to see some effects of that in 2025 and even more in 2026. But hey, what if Russia decides to try and offset potential shortages in barrel artillery by turning more to multiple rocket launchers? I won't dwell too long here because I did recently do an entire video on the role of rocket artillery in Ukraine. But one element of that piece worth bringing back is the RUSI assessment that Russia has put a lot of effort into massively scaling up the production of artillery rockets, in part potentially to offset shortages in barrel artillery ammo. And while there is currently probably no shortage of these systems in active Russian service, especially compared to the available ammo, if you look at what's visibly left in the Russian storages, it's arguably even worse than with the cannon artillery. Pre-invasion, there were almost 1,000 BM-21s visible in Russian storage. As of the latest images, the number of visibly decent vehicles is down to about 120, and if you adjust for imagery age, that probably drops down into the double digits. In percentage terms, the BM-21s are roughly 85 to 95% depleted, while most of the larger BM-27s are gone, and most of what's left is assessed as being broken. The very large, very dangerous, very long-range BM-30s have also almost entirely disappeared. There are only 17 of these rare systems visible in storage pre-invasion, and as of June 2024, that number was down to 2. Those numbers might seem small, but to keep things in perspective, Russia is only visually confirmed to have lost a single BM-30 since February 2022, meaning that, technically speaking, Assad's forces in Syria are visually confirmed to have lost several times more 300mm rocket artillery systems than Russia has, and they've managed to do it in less than 14 days of special military operation, rather than 1,000. As seems to be a bit of a recurring theme across different Russian equipment categories, there are some new-build MRLs in the force, but they just don't seem to be available in the kind of numbers that would seriously move the needle. Russian state media has talked up a lot, for example, the capabilities of the next-generation Tornado series MRLs. That includes the 300mm Tornado S, which the TASS article on the right there claims has a 100% accuracy rate when using advanced munitions, while the Tornado G is the 122mm equivalent to the old BM-21. And to give you a one data point clue as to their potential relevance in Ukraine, at time of recording there have been 294 visually confirmed Russian BM-21 losses. For the Tornado G, firing the same caliber rockets and filling the same missions, the number's 19. It's very seldom the case that Russia can't build new stuff, it's that it can't build enough new stuff. The big picture takeaways here are probably that Russia has already gotten most of what they're ever going to get out of their MRL storages. That'll presumably limit their ability going forward to just continuing to bulk out the force with more and more launchers, but I'd suggest the main bottleneck going forward is still going to be rocket ammunition, not rocket launchers. If Russia has pulled about 200 BM-27s out of storage, for example, but is only producing about 17,000 rockets in the relevant caliber per the RUSI estimates, that's a grand total of 85 rockets per year, per system capable of dumping 16 of them in 20 seconds. Not counting, any of the BM-27s that were already in active service. So while the depletion of Russia's MRL storages is getting increasingly close to total, from a sustainability perspective, it's probably not where I'd suggest focusing the analysis going forward. And speaking of the big picture going forward, let's talk about it, including some of the potential curveballs that might throw off some of these estimates, and what the whole situation might mean for the war in Ukraine. Complicating factor 1 is where Russia might be able to get vehicles other than from long-term storage facilities. A big example here would be the thousands of pieces of heavy equipment that are currently kept at repair facilities, not in storage yards. The image you can see on screen there is of one of those repair bases, the 103rd, provided by the team at Front Intelligence Insights, who were monitoring the facility back in 2023 to see how quickly it was turning out reactivated T-62s. One of the clues enabling them to do that, by the way, was that when the Russians did reactivate a vehicle, they also conveniently gave it a new coat of paint, obligingly colour-coding the completed vehicles for the benefit of overhead assets. As you can see, some of these bases can be quite large, so even if Russia ran through all of the equipment it had in storage, it would then presumably still take a bit longer to burn through all of the equipment that's already been sent from storage to these repair facilities. External supply is absolutely also something to keep an eye on, especially from North Korea, given we've already seen evidence of the North Koreans supplying some systems like the 170mm Koksan self-propelled gun, anti-tank guided missile vehicles, and other resources the North Koreans might be willing to part with, like North Koreans. Finally, we don't know how much offensive force the Russians are going to continue to try to apply, or how effectively the Ukrainians are going to be able to continue to inflict losses. And the sustainability of the Russian equipment park might owe a lot to whether or not the burn rates in 2025 look more like 2023 or 2024. Which leaves us with the really big picture trends and implications. We spent the better part of an hour going through charts, counts, and patterns, but what I want to do in closing is ask just what all this might mean for the Russian military and the war in Ukraine. I think what a lot of the data suggests at a high level is that across multiple equipment categories, in 2022, Russia probably had more equipment in storage than it could possibly use at short notice. In 2023 and 2024, stock levels started to degrade, but were still broadly sufficient. But going into 2025, things might start getting a bit harder, with the projections becoming increasingly desperate if you look out to 2026 or 2027. And presumably, the closer Russia gets to that depletion point, the weaker its bargaining position at any negotiation is likely to be. We also know that shortages and bottlenecks aren't uniform across systems categories. Some quite notable storages are already either depleted or close to being so, while others may be sufficient to keep up with current burn rates for years. The question is not whether or not Russia can sustain the current level of effort, it's whether it can sustain it long enough to secure a positive conclusion in Ukraine. We can predict when Russia might have significant equipment issues. It ranges from 2025 to 2026, depending on the category. But what we don't know yet is whether that will be long enough for the West to give up and Ukraine to be abandoned to its fate. The argument will be that the Russian gamble may be, and may always have been, that even if they don't have infinite stuff, they have enough to make it as far as they need to go. Determining whether or not that's likely to be the case really requires a comparative analysis. So you can expect that in the near future we'll be looking more closely at the Ukrainian military, the many challenges it faces, and how long it's likely to be able to sustain the fight, given the stocks of equipment it's believed to have, and what we predict they'll be receiving in 2025. But here's the thing. Even if the Russian military manages to make it to an end of sorts in Ukraine, whether that be a temporary ceasefire or a permanent peace deal, with so much of its strategic storage now depleted, the Russian military might find itself in a very awkward position. Pre-February 2022, the Russian equipment and investment model was very different to that you saw in many NATO countries, but it did make a certain degree of sense. Much of the procurement budget was consistently focused on getting the military a steady, if limited, supply of new and more modern material. Realistically, they probably needed to do that in order to keep their designers busy and their production lines hot, as well as to make sure the country could potentially have some new products that might be competitive on the export market. But at a top level, there was an enormous mismatch between the amount of new material that Russia was producing and the size of the Russian armed forces. There were just never going to be enough new T-90Ms, BMP-3s, aircraft or artillery systems to replace everything in inventory in a reasonable time. And so in order to achieve mass to equip the vast majority of its forces, Russia was still relying on upgraded or evolutions of old Soviet material. And similarly for the defence industry itself that often struggles to be profitable given the prices that the government was willing to pay, exporting refurbished, repaired and reactivated material abroad for significant prices was a major source of profitability and financial sustainability. Then, as we've seen, if a war did break out, the Russian military didn't need to rely on the defence industry being large enough in order to supply everything that needed to fight that war, because there was more than enough material in storage to cover a lot of attrition, a lot of consumption, and even mobilisation and scaling up the force. In short, these reserves of Soviet equipment were critical to the ability of the Russian military to be as large as it was and fight the way it does on the budget it had. As the Ukrainians have steadily ground through those stockpiles, though, I think it's a massive question of what comes next if Russia looks to reconstitute its armed forces. Realistically, at this point, a lot of resources in Russia have gone into building up the industry, the workforce, and the military structures to sustain the fight using this repair and reactivation model. But if Russia is interested in long-term competition with NATO, security in Asia, or even a face-off with a potentially rearming Ukraine, you probably don't want to put a force using T-62s, BMP-2s, and Cold War-era artillery up against forces that might be fielding the likes of Leopard 2A8s or whatever next-generation systems we see arrive in the 2030s. Assault sheds and turtle tanks may be well suited to facing off against FPV threats, but I can't imagine they do particularly well if they ran into a wall of Polish MBTs. A lot of export customers probably also aren't going to be willing to pay a premium for reactivated Soviet-era kit, and even if they were, the pool of available raw material now looks much more limited than it once did. In short, I'd argue stored equipment was central to a lot of Russia's strategic options. It was the basis for its ability to fight a long, drawn-out attritional struggle like this one, or to support allies by handing them large amounts of equipment. Having several spare countries' worth of leftover Soviet equipment in storage is a heck of a strategic trump card. But by playing that card in Ukraine, Russia now isn't going to have it in future. And what that might mean for Russia's future strategy, options, and the reconstitution of the Russian armed forces is a topic absolutely worth exploring another time. And okay, let's add on a channel update to close out. Firstly, as I said earlier in the video, my thanks in this one really go out to some of those individuals involved in counting all of these vehicles in Russian storages and monitoring the bases so closely. For most people, counting thousands and thousands of metal boxes in satellite imagery is a pretty challenging gig, but the likes of Covert, Cabal, HIMARS and Jompy don't just do it, they do it again and again and again and release their findings publicly. There's a lot that I can do with Russian economic and production data and visually confirmed losses, but the storage count data is an absolutely invaluable tool. Secondly, for those of you watching the international news, I'm sure you've noticed there are a couple of things happening in Syria at the moment. I made the decision, as I often do, to hold off any coverage of that until the dust begins to settle, so I hope you understand why it's this piece that I chose to release today. Over the next couple of days, I'll keep an eye on the situation, but until then, thank you very much to all of you as always for your ongoing support and engagement, and I hope to see you all again next week.